Millionaire gives ride to single mother on the road at night, but upon hearing her name he becomes desperate. The rhythmic patter of rain against the windscreen of his Bentley Continental GT created a hypnotic symphony as Marcus Blackwood navigated the winding country roads of Yorkshire. The leather-clad steering wheel felt cool beneath his grip, a stark contrast to the warmth of the heated seats that cocooned him from the autumn chill outside. At 47, Marcus had grown accustomed to the solitude that accompanied his success. The empty passenger seat beside him, a familiar sight on his frequent business trips between London and Manchester. The dashboard clock displayed 23:47, its soft blue glow a gentle reminder of the late hour. Marcus had chosen to drive rather than take his usual private car service, seeking the therapeutic solace that came with being alone on the road. His mind wandered to the board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning, where he would present his latest investment strategy to eager shareholders. Through the rain-streaked windows, the headlights carved a path through the darkness, illuminating the hedgerows that lined the narrow country lane. The weather forecast had predicted storms, but the intensity of the downpour surpassed all expectations. Marcus adjusted the wipers to their highest setting, leaning forward slightly as he peered through the glass. As he rounded a bend, something caught his eye. A figure, barely visible through the curtain of rain, walking along the roadside. Marcus's first instinct was to drive past, as one often does on country roads at night, but something made him ease his foot off the accelerator. The figure was hunched against the weather, clearly ill-prepared for such conditions. "Bloody hell," he muttered, pressing the brake pedal. The Bentley's advanced safety systems responded smoothly, bringing the vehicle to a gentle stop several meters ahead of the pedestrian. Marcus flicked on his hazard lights, illuminating the surrounding area in alternating amber flashes. Through his rear-view mirror, he watched as the figure approached, and his heart seemed to skip a beat. Even through the rain-blurred glass, there was something hauntingly familiar about the way the person walked. He pressed the button to lower his passenger window, and the sound of the storm filled the car's quiet interior. The woman, for he could now see it was indeed a woman, approached the window. She wore a beige cardigan, now thoroughly soaked, over what appeared to be nurse's scrubs. Her grey-streaked hair clung to her face, and when she leaned down to peer into the car, Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. "Sarah?" The name left his lips before he could stop it, barely a whisper above the sound of the rain. The woman's eyes widened in recognition, and for a moment neither spoke. 18 years of silence stretched between them like an invisible barrier, more tangible than the car door that separated them. Sarah, his half-sister, looked older than he remembered. The years had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, but there was no mistaking those distinctive green eyes, so like their father's. "Marcus?" Her voice wavered. Whether from cold or emotion, he couldn't tell. I fell asleep on the bus, missed my stop. I've been walking for hours." Marcus felt an overwhelming surge of emotions, guilt, concern, and a strange sense of destiny. For nearly 2 decades, he had successfully avoided any contact with his family, building his empire while deliberately distancing himself from the mess of relationships he'd left behind. Yet here, on a random stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, the past had quite literally walked back into his life. "Get in," he heard himself say, reaching across to open the passenger door. "You're soaked through." Sarah hesitated for a moment, and in that pause Marcus saw the weight of their shared history, the arguments, the accusations, the day he'd walked away from everything. But then she moved, sliding into the leather seat with a whispered thank you that seemed to carry the weight of years. The interior light illuminated her properly now, and Marcus could see that she was shivering. Without a word, he adjusted the climate control, directing warm air towards her, and reached into the back seat for the cashmere blanket he kept there for long drives. "You're working at the hospital?" he asked, noting her uniform as he handed her the blanket. "Still am," she replied, wrapping herself in the soft fabric. "Night shift at Leeds General. I dozed off on the bus home." She trailed off, and Marcus noticed how pale she looked. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his businessman's instinct for detecting problems kicking in. I'm not sure," Sarah admitted, and Marcus noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched the blanket. Without further discussion, Marcus checked his mirrors and pulled back onto the road, but instead of continuing towards Manchester, he turned the car around. He knew of a 24-hour services station about 15 minutes back, It wasn't the Ritz, but it would have to do. As they drove in silence, Marcus couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. For years, he'd carefully orchestrated his life to avoid any chance encounters with family, maintaining a calculated distance from the emotional complications of his past. Yet here he was, sharing his car with the very person who had been at the center of the rift that tore their family apart. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windscreen, but now it seemed less like an obstacle and more like a cleansing force, washing away years of carefully constructed barriers. Neither spoke as the car ate up the miles, but the silence wasn't entirely uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of unspoken words and the possibility of something neither of them had expected to find on this rain-soaked night: a chance at redemption. The fluorescent lights of the service station cast a harsh glow over the nearly empty cafe. At this hour, the only other customers were a pair of lorry drivers nursing cups of coffee at the counter. Marcus guided Sarah to a booth in the corner, away from the draft of the automatic doors. The vinyl seats squeaked as they sat down, a sound that seemed absurdly loud in the quiet space. Sarah still wore the blanket around her shoulders, though some color had returned to her cheeks in the warmth of the building. A young waitress approached their table, stifling a yawn as she pulled out her notepad. "Full English for both of us," Marcus said before Sarah could speak. "And tea, Earl Grey if you have it." He glanced at his half-sister. "Unless you'd prefer something else." Sarah shook her head, a ghost of a smile playing at her lips. "You remember how I take my tea?" "Some things you don't forget," Marcus replied, then immediately wondered if he'd said too much. The waitress retreated, leaving them alone with 18 years of unspoken words between them. Sarah broke the silence first. "Thomas asks about you sometimes." The mention of her son sent a jolt through Marcus. The boy, no, he'd be a man now, had been just 5 when Marcus had last seen him. A bright-eyed child with his mother's determined chin and his father's dark curls. How is he?" Marcus asked, his usual confident tone wavering slightly. "He's finishing his medical residency," Sarah said, and Marcus didn't miss the pride in her voice. "Top of his class at Edinburgh. He's specializing in pediatric care." "Following in your footsteps then," Marcus observed, remembering how Sarah had fought her way through nursing school as a single mother, refusing any offers of financial help. The waitress returned with their tea, and both siblings reached for their cups, grateful for the momentary distraction. Marcus watched as Sarah added milk first, then sugar, exactly as she had done since they were children sharing breakfast in their father's kitchen. "The hospital's been good to me," Sarah said, cradling her cup. "Promoted to ward sister last year. It's not millions in the bank, but..." She trailed off, and Marcus felt the familiar sting of her implied criticism. "Sarah," he began, but she cut him off. "I'm not judging, Marcus, not anymore. We all made our choices." The arrival of their food interrupted whatever response Marcus might have made. Steam rose from the plates piled high with eggs, bacon, and toast, and Sarah's eyes widened at the sight. She began to eat with careful dignity that couldn't quite mask her hunger. As they ate, Marcus found himself studying his half-sister. Behind the new lines on her face and the grey in her hair, he could still see traces of the fierce young woman who had stood in his office 18 years ago, demanding he choose between family loyalty and business opportunity. He had chosen business, convinced he was making the rational decision. His investment in the development project had indeed made him millions, but it had also resulted in the closure of the community center, where Sarah had run her youth programs. "The center," he said suddenly, putting down his fork. "What happened to the kids from your programs?" Sarah's hand paused halfway to her mouth. "Some found other places. Most didn't. That's how it goes, isn't it? The vulnerable are always the first to fall through the cracks." Her words carried no accusation, but Marcus felt their weight nonetheless. He thought about the portfolio of properties his company now owned, the billions in investments, the board meetings and strategic planning sessions. All of it suddenly seemed hollow compared to the simple dignity with which Sarah had carried on, continuing to serve her community despite everything. "I've been thinking about diversifying," he said carefully, stirring his tea. "Social investment projects. There's a growing market for it." Sarah looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Marcus, just thinking out loud," he added quickly. "The business landscape is changing. Corporate social responsibility isn't just a buzzword anymore." The corner of Sarah's mouth twitched. "Still speaking in business terms, I see." "Old habits," he admitted, and for the first time that night they shared a genuine smile. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. Marcus glanced at his watch. It was well past midnight now, and his Manchester meeting seemed increasingly insignificant. "Let me drive you home," he offered. "You must be exhausted." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "That would be... Thank you." As they stood to leave, Sarah carefully folded the cashmere blanket. When she tried to hand it back, Marcus shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "It suits you better anyway." Walking back to the car, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The rain-soaked encounter that had begun as an inconvenience now felt like something else entirely, perhaps an opportunity, or even a sign. As he opened the passenger door for Sarah, he made a decision. "That meeting I was heading to," he said as they settled into their seats. "It was about a new development project. I think I might need some advice about the community impact assessment." Sarah buckled her seatbelt, her expression unreadable. "Is that so? Who better to consult than a ward sister with 18 years of community service?" He started the engine, not looking at her. "If you're interested, that is." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then Sarah spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I might know some people you should talk to." As Marcus guided the Bentley back onto the rain-slicked road, he felt the weight of years beginning to lift. Sometimes, he realized, the most important business decisions weren't made in boardrooms at all, but in unexpected moments on dark and stormy nights. The following morning, Marcus sat in his home office, staring at his mobile phone. The Manchester meeting had been rescheduled, his assistant handling the change with her usual efficiency. Now, dressed in casual wear rather than his usual bespoke suit, he contemplated the number he'd just typed in. Sarah's number, hastily scribbled on a napkin before they'd parted ways. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Hampstead mansion, sunlight streamed in, creating patterns on the antique Persian rug. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a crisp autumn morning that seemed to mock his tumultuous thoughts. "Ring her," a voice said from the doorway. Marcus looked up to see his son, James, leaning against the doorframe. At 25, James was the spitting image of Marcus at that age, though his choice of vintage band t-shirts and sustainable fashion brands set him apart from his father's conservative style. "I see Agnes told you about last night," Marcus said, referring to his assistant. James entered the room, dropping into one of the leather armchairs. "She mentioned you missed the Manchester meeting. I figured either you'd finally had a breakdown from overwork, or something interesting had happened." He paused, studying his father's face. "Aunt Sarah, then?" Marcus nodded, wondering when his son had become so perceptive. Perhaps it had been during those years at Oxford, or during his time working with tech startups in Silicon Valley. James had always been different from him, more intuitive, more focused on social impact than profit margins. "She hasn't changed much," Marcus said, his fingers still hovering over the phone. "Still dedicated to her cause, still making you question your life choices?" James suggested, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Marcus shot his son a look, but there was no real irritation behind it. "When did you become so wise?" "Probably around the time I realized that all my friends' parents were involved in their children's schools, while my father was involved in hostile takeovers." James's tone was light, but Marcus felt the sting of truth in his words. "I provided for you," Marcus began, but James waved him off. "Dad, I'm not complaining. You gave me every opportunity. But maybe that's why I chose to work with social enterprise startups instead of joining your investment firm. I wanted to build something meaningful." Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not just the successful young entrepreneur, but also the little boy who used to play with Thomas, Sarah's son, during family gatherings before everything fell apart. "Do you remember your cousin Thomas?" Marcus asked suddenly. James's face lit up. "Course I do. We're connected on social media, actually. He's doing brilliant work in pediatrics. His research on community healthcare access in underserved areas is revolutionary." Marcus blinked, surprised. "You keep in touch with him?" "Welcome to the 21st century, Dad," James laughed. "Not everyone maintains family feuds like Victorian nobles. Thomas and I chat occasionally. He's actually presenting his research at a medical conference in London next week." The information hit Marcus like a physical force. His nephew, The boy he'd last seen playing with toy cars on his office floor was now a doctor presenting research papers. He'd missed everything: graduations, achievements, the transformation from child to man. "James," Marcus said slowly, "what would you say if I told you I was considering a new kind of investment?" His son raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. Something that combines business acumen with social impact. A project that could potentially rebuild bridges while also creating real change in communities." James leaned forward, his expression suddenly intense. "Now that sounds like something I'd be interested in. What brought this on?" Marcus thought about Sarah in her rain-soaked cardigan, about her quiet dignity as she spoke of her work, about the years of service she'd given to her community while he'd been chasing bigger profits and better deals. "Let's just say I had an unexpected wake-up call," he replied, "but I'll need help. Your expertise in social enterprise, Sarah's community experience, and perhaps," he hesitated, "perhaps Thomas's medical knowledge. A family business?" James's eyes sparkled with interest. "But different from your usual ventures." "Very different," Marcus agreed, looking down at his phone again, "assuming Sarah's willing to even consider it." James stood up, stretching. "Only one way to find out, isn't there?" He walked to the door, then paused. "Oh, and Dad?" "Thomas's presentation is on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Royal College of Physicians. Just in case you're interested." As James left the room, Marcus finally pressed the call button. The phone rang 3 times before Sarah's voice answered, slightly breathless. "Marcus, I wasn't sure you'd actually call." "Neither was I," he admitted. "But I've been thinking about what you said last night, about community impact. Would you be willing to meet again? Perhaps with James and Thomas?" The pause that followed seemed to last an eternity. Then Sarah spoke, her voice cautious but not unwelcoming. "Thomas's presentation is next Tuesday. He's speaking about community healthcare initiatives. It might be relevant to your interests." Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "Tuesday at 2 p.m. at the Royal College of Physicians?" Sarah's surprise was audible. "How did you—" "Let's just say I have my sources," Marcus replied. "Sarah, I know we can't erase the past 18 years, but perhaps we can build something new, something that matters." Another pause, shorter this time. "Bring James," she said finally. "Thomas would like to see his cousin again. In person this time, not just on social media." As Marcus ended the call, he felt a strange mixture of anxiety and hope. Next Tuesday would either be another business meeting in a lifetime of business meetings, or it would be the beginning of something entirely new. Looking out at the autumn sunshine, he rather hoped it would be the latter. The Royal College of Physicians stood proud against the London skyline, its classical architecture, a testament to centuries of medical tradition. Marcus adjusted his tie. He'd opted for a less formal suit today, as he and James climbed the steps. Inside, the marble foyer buzzed with activity as medical professionals and academics gathered for the afternoon's presentations. "There's Aunt Sarah," James whispered, nodding toward the reception area. She stood talking to a tall young man in a well-fitted grey suit, her nurse's uniform replaced by a professional blazer and skirt. The young man turned as they approached, and Marcus felt his breath catch. Thomas had his mother's eyes, but the set of his jaw and the way he carried himself reminded Marcus painfully of their father. At 23, he cut an impressive figure, his medical badge identifying him as Dr. Thomas Bennett, pediatric resident. "Uncle Marcus," Thomas said, his voice deeper than Marcus remembered. "It's been a while." The understatement hung in the air for a moment before James stepped forward, breaking the tension with a warm handshake that turned into a hug. "Mate, your latest paper on community health initiatives was brilliant. That bit about preventive care in urban populations, game-changing stuff." Thomas's professional demeanor cracked slightly as he grinned at his cousin. "Still reading medical journals in your spare time then?" "Only the ones that align with my social impact investments," James replied. "Speaking of which, we should talk about some ideas I've been developing." Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Perhaps we should find our seats. The session's about to begin." They filed into the auditorium, finding places near the front. Marcus noticed how Sarah sat straight-backed, proud, as her son was introduced by the session chair. As Thomas took the podium, Marcus saw not just his nephew but a glimpse of what might have been and what still could be. Thomas's presentation was compelling. He spoke about the gaps in community healthcare, about preventive programs that could save both lives and money, about the need for innovative solutions that combined medical expertise with business acumen. His slides showed statistics, but also faces, real people affected by lack of access to proper healthcare. The solution, Thomas concluded, isn't just more funding. It's about creating sustainable systems that serve communities while generating enough revenue to maintain and expand services. We need to think differently about healthcare delivery, combining social responsibility with business efficiency. During the Q&A session, James leaned over to whisper to his father, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Marcus nodded slowly. He was seeing possibilities, connections, opportunities, but not in the way he usually did. This wasn't about profit margins and market share. This was about legacy, about family, about making amends in the most meaningful way possible. After the presentation, they gathered in the college's cafe. Thomas had loosened his tie, looking more like the boy Marcus remembered as he laughed at one of James's jokes. Sarah watched her son with evident pride, but Marcus caught the worried crease in her brow, the look of a mother who had spent years ensuring her child's success against all odds. "Your research," Marcus said, setting down his coffee cup. "How much support do you have for implementing these ideas?" Thomas straightened slightly. "There's interest, but funding is always a challenge. Most investors want quick returns, and community healthcare is a long-term investment." "What if," James interjected, "you had access to both capital and business expertise, combined with your medical knowledge and your mother's community experience?" Sarah looked sharply at her brother. "Marcus?" "I've been thinking," Marcus said carefully, "about real legacy. Not just buildings with my name on them, but actual change. James has been telling me about social impact investments for years, but I never really listened. Perhaps it's time I did." Thomas glanced between his mother and his uncle. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "A partnership," James said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Combining Thomas's medical expertise, Aunt Sarah's community knowledge, Dad's business acumen, and my experience in social enterprise. We could create something unprecedented. A healthcare initiative that's both sustainable and accessible," Thomas mused, looking thoughtful. "With proper funding and business structure. We could start with a pilot program," Marcus suggested, warming to the idea. "Perhaps in the same community where," he paused, looking at Sarah, "where the old community center used to be." Sarah's expression was unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Full circle then, with a few improvements," Marcus replied softly. As the conversation flowed, plans beginning to take shape, Marcus watched his family, his son's passionate gestures as he discussed social enterprise models, his nephew's thoughtful contributions about medical needs, his sister's practical insights about community engagement. This, he realized, was what he'd been missing all these years while chasing bigger deals and better returns. The autumn sunshine streamed through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow over their table. Outside, London hummed with its usual energy, but here, in this moment, something new was being born. Not just a business venture, but a bridge across 18 years of silence, a chance to transform old wounds into future healing. Thomas was pulling up statistics on his tablet, James was sketching organizational charts on a napkin, and Sarah was listing potential community partners. Marcus sat back, feeling a strange sense of peace. Sometimes the best investments weren't about money at all, but about believing in something bigger than yourself and the people who could help you build it. 6 weeks after the medical conference, Marcus stood on a piece of land he hadn't visited in 18 years. The old community center had long since been replaced by a derelict warehouse, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. But where others might see decay, Marcus now saw possibility. Sarah walked beside him, her boots crunching on the gravel as they surveyed the site. She'd taken the morning off from her hospital duties to be here, and Marcus noticed how the other members of the planning committee naturally gravitated toward her as they arrived for the site inspection. The structural engineer's report came back positive, James announced, joining them with a tablet in hand. "The building's foundations are solid. We can retain the basic structure while completely renovating the interior." Thomas, who had traveled down from Edinburgh for the week, was deep in conversation with a local GP. If we position the pediatric unit here, he gestured toward the eastern wing, it would provide easy access from the main road. We could even install a separate entrance for emergency cases. Marcus watched his nephew with quiet admiration. In the week since their reunion, Thomas had thrown himself into the project with remarkable enthusiasm, bringing both medical expertise and a deep understanding of the community's needs. The local council's planning committee has fast-tracked our application, Marcus said, addressing the group. But they've added a condition. They want to see community involvement in the planning stages. Sarah smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. Already arranged. I've invited the Residents Association to tonight's meeting, along with representatives from local schools and community groups. James raised an eyebrow, impressed. You've been busy, Aunt Sarah. I never really left this community, she replied softly. Even after the old center closed, I kept in touch. People here trust me. The unspoken words hung in the air. Unlike you, they seemed to say. But there was no bitterness in Sarah's tone, only a gentle reminder of the bridges they still needed to rebuild. A sleek car pulled up outside the chain-link fence, and Marcus recognized Richard Pembroke, his company's chief financial officer. Richard's presence had been a concession to the board, a watchdog to ensure their social enterprise didn't stray too far from sound financial principles. Marcus, Richard called out, picking his way carefully across the uneven ground. The board's asking questions about the projected return on investment. They're concerned about the scale of the renovation costs. Before Marcus could respond, James stepped forward. I've prepared a detailed analysis. Our hybrid model combines traditional revenue streams with social impact bonds. We've already had interest from 3 major healthcare trusts. Thomas joined in, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd inherited from his mother. The preventive care programs alone will generate significant cost savings for the NHS. We've got the data to prove it. Richard looked taken aback by the united front. Marcus felt a surge of pride. His son and nephew made a formidable team, combining James's business acumen with Thomas's medical knowledge. The numbers will work, Marcus assured his CFO. But more importantly, this project will work. Sometimes you have to trust in something bigger than profit margins. As Richard retreated to make his calls, Sarah touched Marcus's arm lightly. You've changed, she observed. Perhaps I'm just remembering who I used to be, he replied. Before everything went wrong. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the architects. The next hour was spent in detailed discussions about layout plans, accessibility requirements, and environmental considerations. James had insisted on incorporating green technology, while Thomas advocated for spaces that could adapt to different medical needs. As the morning wore on, Marcus found himself increasingly standing back, watching his family take charge. James handled the business negotiations with a subtle touch that made Marcus wonder who had really been teaching whom. Thomas's medical knowledge commanded respect from the healthcare consultants, while Sarah's quiet words carried weight with the community representatives. Later, as they gathered in a nearby cafe for lunch, Marcus looked around the table at his family. James was showing Thomas something on his laptop, their heads bent together in concentration. Sarah was reviewing the morning's notes, her practical experience helping to refine their ambitious plans. We'll need to be prepared for tonight's community meeting, Sarah said, looking up from her papers. Some people still remember what happened to the old center. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of past decisions. Then we'll need to show them this is different, that we're different. Are we? Sarah asked, but her tone was curious rather than accusatory. I'd like to think we are, Marcus replied. All of us. James closed his laptop. The old center was about what the community lost. This project is about what we can all gain, together. Thomas raised his coffee cup. To new beginnings? As they touched their cups in a makeshift toast, Marcus felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The morning's negotiations had been complex. The challenges ahead were significant, but something fundamental had shifted. They weren't just building a medical center. They were rebuilding a family. Outside, the autumn sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across their table. Tonight they would face the community. Tomorrow there would be more meetings, more challenges, more bridges to rebuild. But for now, in this moment, Marcus allowed himself to believe that sometimes the best investments were the ones that couldn't be measured in pounds and pence. The cafe door chimed as Richard entered, no doubt with more questions from the board. But this time Marcus wasn't worried. He had something better than spreadsheets and profit projections. He had family. The community hall was packed, every folding chair occupied and people standing along the walls. The familiar scent of institutional coffee mingled with the tension in the air as Sarah stepped up to the podium. Marcus watched from his seat in the front row, acutely aware of the whispers and sideways glances from the assembled residents. "Many of you know me," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "I've been your nurse, your neighbor, your friend. Some of you were there when the old community center closed. Tonight, we're here to talk about building something new, something better." The projector hummed to life as James took over, presenting their vision for the new medical center. The architectural renderings showed a modern facility that somehow managed to complement the area's Victorian architecture. Thomas followed with a detailed explanation of the medical services they planned to offer. Then came the moment Marcus had been dreading, the open forum. An elderly woman stood first, her voice quavering but determined. "I remember when your brother closed our center, Sarah dear. My grandchildren used to go to the after-school programs there." Marcus felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. He stood slowly, facing the community he'd once viewed simply as numbers on a development proposal. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, recognizing her from his past life, "you're right. 18 years ago, I made a decision that hurt this community. I can't undo that, but I can try to make amends." A murmur ran through the crowd. A young man near the back spoke up. "Fine words, Mr. Blackwood, but what's to stop you selling us out again when a better offer comes along?" Before Marcus could respond, James stood. "Because this time it's different. The facility will be owned by a community trust. My father's company is providing the initial investment, but control will rest with a board that includes community representatives." "And who's going to sit on this board?" someone called out. Sarah stepped forward. "We're hoping some of you will. We need people who know this community, who understand its needs. This isn't about imposing something from outside, it's about building something together." Thomas added his voice, speaking with the passion that had made his medical presentation so compelling. "The center will combine top-tier medical care with community programs. We're not just treating illnesses, we're creating a hub for health, education, and community support." The questions continued, probing and often skeptical. But as the evening wore on, Marcus noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. When a local teacher stood up to enthusiastically support the proposed after-school science program, heads nodded in agreement. When a young mother spoke about the difficulties of accessing specialist care for her child, Thomas's thoughtful response drew appreciative murmurs. The turning point came when Mrs. Harrison spoke again. "Sarah, dear, you've always been one of us. If you're vouching for this project and your brother, well, perhaps it's time we gave it a chance." As the meeting concluded, people lingered, forming small groups to discuss the proposals. Marcus found himself in conversation with a retired builder who had excellent suggestions about making the facility more accessible for elderly patients. James was surrounded by young professionals eager to discuss volunteer opportunities, while Thomas fielded detailed questions about medical services. Sarah touched Marcus's arm, drawing him aside. "Well, that went better than expected." "Thanks to you," he said quietly. "They trust you, Sarah. You never left them." She studied him for a moment. "You know this won't be easy, right? They'll be watching every move we make, questioning every decision." "Good," Marcus replied. "It'll keep us honest. Keep me honest." James joined them, his expression thoughtful. "We'll need to adjust some of the plans based on tonight's feedback. The community has valid concerns about parking and operating hours." Thomas appeared with his notebook full of scribbled suggestions. "And we should consider adding a dental clinic." Several people mentioned the lack of NHS dental services in the area. As they discussed the community's input, Marcus realized something had changed during the meeting. The project had ceased to be just their vision. It was becoming something bigger, something that belonged to everyone in the room. Later, as they locked up the community hall, the autumn evening had turned chilly. Sarah pulled her cardigan closer, the same beige cardigan she'd worn on that rainy night that had started everything. "You still have doubts?" Marcus asked her, noting her pensive expression. "Not doubts exactly," she replied. "Just Awareness of the responsibility we're taking on. These people are trusting us with their hopes, Marcus. We can't let them down. We won't, he said, and was surprised to realize how much he meant it. Not this time. They walked to their cars together, a family united by purpose. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. The sound seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, not just for their family, but for an entire community. As Marcus watched Sarah drive away, followed by James and Thomas in their respective cars, he remained in the car park for a moment longer. The community hall's lights were still on, silhouetting the last few residents as they discussed the evening's revelations. In their animated gestures and earnest conversations, he saw something he'd missed 18 years ago: the true value of community, of belonging, of building something that mattered. He pulled out his phone to make a note about the dental clinic suggestion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove that change was possible. But for now, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the evening's success, not in signatures on contracts or numbers in spreadsheets, but in the cautious hope he'd seen in the eyes of the community he'd once abandoned. 3 months into the renovation project, Marcus stood in what would soon become the center's main reception area. The space was still raw, with exposed beams and unfinished walls, but the potential was undeniable. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed skylights, illuminating workers as they installed eco-friendly heating systems James had insisted upon. "The pediatric wing is ahead of schedule," Thomas announced, walking in with a hard hat tucked under his arm. He'd taken a temporary leave from his Edinburgh position to oversee the medical planning, and his presence on site had become a familiar sight. "But we've hit a snag with the community space layout." Sarah, who had been reviewing equipment specifications, looked up from her tablet. "What kind of snag?" "The youth group and the elderly association both want the ground floor space near the garden," James explained, joining them with fresh coffee for everyone. A morning ritual he'd instituted. Both have valid arguments about accessibility and natural light. Marcus watched as his son distributed the cups, noting how naturally James had stepped into his role as project coordinator. The past months had revealed sides of James he'd never fully appreciated before: his diplomatic skills, his ability to balance competing interests, his genuine commitment to community engagement. "What if we redesigned the garden space itself?" Sarah suggested. "Create different zones that could be used by both groups at different times? My patients at the hospital always talk about the therapeutic benefits of gardening." Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "We could incorporate it into our wellness programs. Intergenerational activities have shown promising results in community health studies." "The budget's getting tight," Marcus admitted, voicing the concern that had been nagging at him. "The asbestos removal cost more than expected, and the sustainable materials James wanted weren't cheap." A familiar voice interrupted them. "Perhaps that's something we should discuss." Richard Pembroke stood in the doorway, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his bespoke suit amidst the construction dust. "The board is expressing concerns about the escalating costs," Richard continued, stepping carefully around a pile of tiles. "They're suggesting we might need to scale back some of the non-essential elements." Marcus felt Sarah stiffen beside him, and he remembered similar conversations from 18 years ago, conversations that had led to decisions he now regretted. But before he could speak, James stepped forward. "I've been working on something," he said, pulling out his tablet. "I've secured interest from 3 major corporate sponsors who want to support the garden project. They're attracted by the environmental and social impact aspects. Plus, I've been talking with a green energy company about using the center as a showcase for their new solar technology," Thomas added. "And my research grant application was approved yesterday. It'll cover part of the specialized pediatric equipment we need." Marcus felt a surge of pride. While he'd been worrying about traditional funding models, his son and nephew had been finding innovative solutions. "The numbers will work, Richard," Marcus said firmly. "And even if they didn't, some things are worth the investment." Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but at that moment, Mrs. Harrison from the Community Association arrived for her weekly site inspection. At 78, she had appointed herself unofficial community liaison, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Sarah, dear," she called out, "those young people from the youth group are here again. They've got more ideas about the garden space. Such enthusiasm. Reminds me of when you used to run programs at the old center. Sarah smiled warmly. Why don't we all take a look at the garden together? Maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone. As they moved outside, Marcus hung back, watching his family interact with the community members who had begun dropping by regularly. Thomas was showing a group of teenagers his plans for the medical training program he hoped to establish. James was deep in conversation with local business owners about sponsorship opportunities. Sarah caught his eye and walked back to join him. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "Just wondering what Dad would think of all this," Marcus replied softly. "Using the family fortune to build something so different from his business empire." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I think he'd be proud. Not of the building or the programs, though those are important, but of this." She gestured to where James and Thomas were now working together, sketching ideas in response to community input. "Of us finding our way back to being a family." A commotion from the garden drew their attention. Mrs. Harrison was enthusiastically describing her vision for a memory garden, while the youth group representatives added suggestions about sustainable planting and accessible pathways. What had started as a conflict was transforming into collaboration. "It's not always going to be this smooth," Sarah warned, but she was smiling. "There will be more challenges, more difficult decisions." "I know," Marcus replied, "but we'll face them together this time." As if to prove her point, Richard approached again, his expression serious. "Marcus, about the board's concerns. Tell them I'll personally guarantee any cost overruns," Marcus said firmly. "And remind them about the tax benefits of the charitable trust structure James designed." Richard sighed but nodded. As he left, James joined them, grinning. "You know, Dad, I might have another solution for the funding issue. How do you feel about crowdfunding?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Crowdfunding? The Blackwood Group using crowdfunding?" "Why not?" Thomas chimed in. "It would give the community a literal investment in the project. I've seen it work brilliantly with other social enterprises." Looking at their eager faces, Marcus felt the last of his old business instincts give way to something new. "Tell me more," he said, and was rewarded with bright smiles from both young men. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. By lunchtime, they had a workable compromise for the garden space, preliminary approval for the crowdfunding campaign, and 3 new community partnerships in development. As they gathered for their now traditional family lunch in the site office, Marcus looked around at his family. Sarah was teaching James some basic medical terminology he'd need for the promotional materials. Thomas was explaining his latest research findings to Mrs. Harrison, who had stayed to share her homemade scones. Outside, the sounds of construction continued, the physical building taking shape. But inside this dusty office, something else was being built, something even more important. One decision, one conversation, one shared meal at a time, they were rebuilding not just a community center, but a family's broken bonds. The winter sun cast long shadows through the half-finished windows of the center as Marcus reviewed the latest project updates. 6 months had passed since that rainy night encounter with Sarah, and sometimes he still couldn't quite believe how much had changed. "The crowdfunding campaign hit its target last night," James announced, bursting into the site office with his characteristic enthusiasm. "Actually, we exceeded it by 30%. Turns out people really connect with the idea of community-owned healthcare." Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she'd been coordinating with her hospital about equipment transfers. "That's wonderful. Have you told Thomas?" "He's in Edinburgh this week, defending his research thesis," James replied, dropping into a chair. "But he's been monitoring the campaign numbers between sessions. Says it's helping him stay calm." Marcus smiled, remembering his own nervousness during Thomas's first presentation months ago. Now his nephew was becoming a respected voice in community healthcare, with several medical journals interested in publishing his findings. The office door opened again, bringing a blast of cold air and an unexpected visitor. "Sorry to interrupt," said a familiar voice. Marcus turned to see Michael Bennett, Thomas's father, standing awkwardly in the doorway. The room fell silent. Michael, who had abandoned Sarah and Thomas 18 years ago, looked older than his years, his once dark hair now completely grey. Sarah's face had gone pale, but she remained composed. "Michael," she said quietly, "this is unexpected." James moved protectively closer to his aunt, while Marcus found himself stepping forward, positioned between Michael and his sister. "I saw the article in The Guardian," Michael said, his voice uncertain, "about the medical center, about Thomas's research. I've been following his career from a distance. He's done so well." "No thanks to you," Marcus said coldly, remembering the years Sarah had struggled alone. But Sarah raised a hand, stopping him. "Why are you here, Michael?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I wanted to contribute something. To the center. I've done well in business overseas, and when I saw what you were all building here—" "We don't need your money," Marcus began, but James interrupted. "Actually," he said thoughtfully, "maybe we should hear him out. Not for the money, but—" He glanced at Sarah. "For Thomas?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying her former husband. Then she spoke, her voice steady. "Thomas is in Edinburgh, defending his doctoral thesis. He's focused on that right now, and I won't have anything disrupt it." Michael nodded quickly. "Of course, I understand. I just thought, maybe after." "That would be his decision to make," Sarah replied. "He's an adult now, Michael. He makes his own choices." A noise from the corridor interrupted them. Mrs. Harrison arriving with her usual timing and a basket of fresh scones. She stopped short at the tension in the room. "Everything all right, dears?" she asked, looking between them with concern. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Harrison," James said smoothly, taking the basket from her. "We were just discussing some potential new support for the center." The elderly woman's eyes narrowed slightly. She had known Sarah long enough to recognize emotional upheaval, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she began laying out her scones and updating them on the latest community news. Michael took advantage of the distraction to retreat, leaving a business card on James's desk. If Thomas wants to reach out," he said quietly, then slipped away. After he left, Sarah excused herself, walking out into the half-finished garden. Marcus followed after a moment, finding her sitting on one of the newly installed benches. "Are you all right?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I don't know," she admitted. "All these years, I've wondered if he ever thought about us. About Thomas now," she gestured helplessly. "You've done an amazing job with Thomas," Marcus said firmly. "You should be proud." "I am," Sarah replied. "But seeing Michael today, it reminded me of everything we lost. Not just the marriage, but the way it divided the family. You and I, we found our way back," Marcus reminded her. "Maybe this is another chance for healing, if Thomas wants it." They sat in companionable silence, watching workers install solar panels on the center's roof. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "You know what's ironic? If you hadn't stopped that night in the rain, if we hadn't started rebuilding our relationship, I might have handled Michael's appearance very differently today." "How so?" "I might have let anger drive him away, but these past months working together, seeing how family can change and grow, it's taught me something about second chances." James appeared in the garden, phone in hand. "Thomas just finished his defense," he announced. "He passed with distinction. He's asking if we can video call." They gathered around James's phone, where Thomas's beaming face filled the screen. As he excitedly described his presentation, Sarah caught Marcus's eye and nodded slightly. They would tell Thomas about his father's visit, but not today. Today was for celebrating achievement, for family pride, for the joy of seeing the shy boy they remembered growing into a confident young doctor. As they talked, the winter sun emerged from behind the clouds, illuminating the garden. Workers continued their tasks around them, adding new pieces to the growing center. Marcus looked at his family. Sarah's proud smile, James's enthusiastic questions, Thomas's animated descriptions, and felt profound gratitude for that rainy night that had changed everything. The center wasn't finished yet. There would be more challenges ahead, more unexpected visitors perhaps, more difficult conversations and decisions, but they would face them together as a family. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the most important foundations weren't made of concrete and steel, but of love, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. Spring had arrived in full force, bringing with it a surge of activity at the nearly completed community medical center. The garden, once a contentious space, now bloomed with carefully planned flower beds and wheelchair-accessible pathways. Elderly residents worked alongside local teenagers, planting herbs in the raised beds that would supply both the center's cafe and its therapeutic programs. Thomas, now permanently relocated from Edinburgh, stood in his newly equipped pediatric wing, directing the installation of the last pieces of medical equipment. The walls were adorned with vibrant murals created by local art students, transforming what could have been a sterile medical space into something welcoming and warm. "The sensory room is ready," he called out to Sarah, who was organizing the nursing station. "Want to see?" Sarah followed her son into a room that seemed magical. Soft lights changed colors gradually, bubble tubes provided gentle illumination, and tactile panels lined the walls at various heights. "This is incredible," she whispered, touching one of the interactive screens. "It's designed for children with special needs," Thomas explained, his voice full of pride. "But honestly, I think everyone could benefit from a few minutes of calm in here." "Your father would have loved this," Sarah said softly, then caught herself. "I mean, it's okay, Mum," Thomas replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I've been thinking about his visit, about his offer to contribute to the center." Before Sarah could respond, James burst into the room, his usual energy somewhat frazzled. "Emergency meeting in the main hall," he announced. "We've hit a snag with the opening ceremony." They gathered in the central space, where Marcus was already waiting with Mrs. Harrison and several community board members. The room, with its high ceilings and natural light, had become the heart of the center, connecting all the different areas together. "The health secretary can't make it to the opening," James explained, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Apparently, there's a crucial vote in Parliament that day. The local press is already asking questions about what this means for our NHS partnership. It's not just about the health secretary," Marcus added. "Some of our corporate sponsors are getting nervous. They were counting on the publicity." Mrs. Harrison snorted. "Since when do we need politicians to validate what we've built here?" Everyone turned to look at her, and she continued with the directness that had made her such a valuable community representative. "This center wasn't built by politicians or corporate sponsors. It was built by us, all of us. Look around." They did look around, seeing what she saw. The reception desk where local college students would train in healthcare administration, the community cafe that would provide job training for young people, the medical training rooms where Thomas would teach the next generation of community healthcare workers. "Mrs. Harrison's right," Sarah said, straightening her shoulders. "We've created something special here, something real. What if—" James started, then paused, his expression thoughtful. "What if instead of one VIP cutting a ribbon, we had everyone who contributed to the center participate in the opening?" Thomas caught on quickly. "The youth group that helped design the garden, the art students who painted the murals, the local businesses that supported us, the construction workers who put in extra hours," Marcus added, warming to the idea. "The medical staff who advised on the layout, the community members who shared their stories and needs." "A celebration of community," Sarah nodded. "That's what this place is really about, isn't it?" As they discussed the new plans, Marcus watched his family in action. James was already reimagining the publicity strategy, his marketing skills put to good use. Thomas was suggesting ways to incorporate health screenings and demonstrations into the opening event. Sarah was coordinating with her hospital colleagues about staffing support. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Marcus found himself back in the sensory room. The gentle lights and quiet atmosphere provided a perfect space for reflection. The door opened quietly and Sarah joined him. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, echoing their familiar exchange. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he replied. "Not just the building, but us. All of us." Sarah nodded, watching the colors shift on the walls. "Thomas asked me something interesting today. He wondered if we should invite Michael to the opening." Marcus tensed slightly. "What did you say?" "I told him it was his decision to make. He's not that hurt 5-year-old anymore. He's a doctor, a healer. Maybe that extends to healing old wounds too." "And how do you feel about that?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. I think that this place has taught us all something about second chances, about building something new from broken pieces." Through the window, they could see James giving a tour to a group of local teachers, gesturing enthusiastically as he explained the after-school programs they had planned. In the garden, Thomas was showing a family with a wheelchair-bound child how the accessible paths would work. 2 weeks until opening, Marcus mused. Remember when we started? When this was just an old warehouse and a crazy idea, Sarah smiled. When my annoying brother picked me up on a rainy night. When my stubborn sister gave me a second chance, he corrected gently. The sound of laughter drifted in from the garden. Mrs. Harrison was teaching some of the younger volunteers about proper plant care, sharing stories about the old community center as she worked. The past and future seemed to merge in that moment, creating something new and precious. We should get back, Sarah said finally. There's still so much to do. Marcus nodded but lingered for a moment in the peaceful room. Through the window he could see the sun setting behind the city skyline, casting a golden glow over the center. In 2 weeks, these halls would be filled with people, patients seeking care, children learning, elderly residents sharing stories, medical students training to serve their community. But more than that, it would be filled with hope. Hope that had started on a rainy night when 2 estranged siblings found their way back to each other. Hope that had grown, like the plants in their community garden, from the smallest seed into something beautiful and lasting. As Marcus left the sensory room, he touched the wall gently, feeling the different textures under his fingers. Sometimes the most profound changes came not from grand gestures or political speeches, but from simple moments of connection, understanding, and love. The morning of the opening ceremony dawned bright and clear. Marcus arrived early, watching the sunrise paint the center's glass facade in shades of gold and rose. The building seemed to glow from within, its modern lines softened by the climbing plants that were already beginning to make their way up the specially designed trellises. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Volunteers moved purposefully through the corridors, setting up information stands and preparing demonstration areas. The community cafe filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods, all prepared by local culinary students. "Dad!" James called out, hurrying over with his tablet in hand. "The local news crew is setting up outside, and the BBC regional team will be here in an hour. The story's already trending on social media. People are calling it a new model for community healthcare." Marcus nodded, but his attention was drawn to Sarah, who stood in the reception area, adjusting her nurse's uniform with trembling hands. Today, she would begin her new role as the center's Director of Community Health Services, a position that would allow her to split her time between hands-on nursing and program development. "Nervous?" he asked, approaching her. "Terrified," she admitted with a small laugh. "What if we've got it all wrong? What if it doesn't work?" "Then we'll fix it," Thomas said, joining them. He was dressed in his doctor's whites, the name badge reading Dr. Thomas Bennett, Pediatric Director, catching the morning light. Together. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Mrs. Harrison had arrived, leading a group of elderly residents who had been involved in the planning process. They were followed by the youth group members, the art students, local business owners, all the people who had contributed to making the center a reality. And then, standing somewhat uncertainly at the back of the crowd, was Michael. Thomas straightened, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. Sarah touched his arm gently. "You don't have to." "I know," Thomas said quietly, "but I want to. He's part of the story too, isn't he? The whole story, not just the good parts." As Thomas moved through the crowd toward his father, James appeared at Marcus's side. "Should we intervene?" "No," Marcus replied, watching as his nephew extended a hand to Michael. "This is Thomas's moment to choose." The conversation between father and son was brief but civil. When they parted, Thomas returned to his family, his shoulders straight and his head high. "He's different than I remembered," was all he said, but his voice held no bitterness. The opening ceremony began not with a ribbon cutting, but with a community breakfast in the main hall. People from all walks of life sat together at long tables, sharing food and stories. Mrs. Harrison had organized a display of photographs showing the center's construction process, from the derelict warehouse to the finished building. As people ate, different members of the community stood to share their hopes for the center. A young mother spoke about the relief of having specialist pediatric care close to home. An elderly gentleman described how the garden project had given him a reason to get up in the morning. A teenage volunteer talked about her dreams of becoming a nurse, inspired by working alongside Sarah. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he looked out at the gathered faces, his family, the community, even Michael sitting quietly at the back, and felt the weight of the moment. 18 years ago, he began, I made a decision that hurt this community. I chose profit over people, business over family. But sometimes life gives you a second chance. Sometimes it takes getting lost to find your way home. He gestured to the people around him. This center isn't just about healthcare, though that's vital. It's about connection, about remembering that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. Every person in this room has contributed to building not just a building, but a community. As the morning progressed, the center came alive. Thomas conducted tours of the medical facilities, explaining how each space had been designed with community input. James led demonstrations of the environmental features, showing how the center would serve as a model for sustainable architecture. Sarah, moving between groups with practiced ease, found herself next to Marcus as they watched a group of children exploring the sensory room. "Remember that rainy night?" she asked softly. "How could I forget? Best wrong turn I ever took." She smiled, watching as Thomas showed a young patient how to use one of the interactive panels. Life's funny, isn't it? How the hardest moments can lead to the most beautiful changes. Before Marcus could respond, James called them over. The BBC crew wanted to interview them together, the family behind the project. As they walked over, Marcus noticed Michael slipping quietly out the door, but he had seen the look on his former brother-in-law's face, a mixture of regret and pride, of loss and hope. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. There were health screenings, community workshops, children's activities, and endless cups of tea served in the bustling cafe. As evening approached, the crowd thinned, leaving behind a comfortable buzz of satisfaction. In the garden, now lit by solar-powered lanterns, the family gathered for a quiet moment. Mrs. Harrison had insisted on joining them, declaring herself an honorary Blackwood after all these months of collaboration. "To new beginnings," Thomas proposed, raising his cup of tea. "To family," James added. "To community," Sarah said softly. "To finding our way home," Marcus finished. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, the center glowed behind them, a beacon of hope, a symbol of renewal, a testament to the power of second chances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new opportunities to serve and grow. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply family, brought back together by a rainy night and the courage to begin again. Mrs. Harrison, practical as ever, broke the moment by producing one of her famous scones from her handbag. "Now then, dears," she said, breaking it into shares. "Who's hungry?" They laughed, sharing the scone as the first stars appeared above them. The garden's herbs released their fragrance into the evening air, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled, marking not an ending, but a beginning. 9 months after the opening ceremony, Marcus sat in what had become his favorite spot in the center's garden. The autumn air carried a familiar crispness, reminiscent of that fateful rainy night that had changed everything. The garden had matured beautifully, with the last of the summer flowers giving way to autumn colors. A group of medical students passed by, notebooks in hand, heading for their morning session with Thomas. The teaching program had exceeded all expectations, with universities across the country expressing interest in their community-based training model. "Uncle Marcus," James's voice carried across the garden. He was leading a delegation of international healthcare professionals who had come to study the center's innovative approach. "Could you join us?" "They're particularly interested in the funding model." Marcus smiled, remembering how skeptical the board had initially been. Now, the center's hybrid funding approach was being studied as a potential template for similar projects worldwide. James had proved himself not just as a businessman, but as a visionary who understood how to blend social impact with sustainable finance. Inside, the center hummed with activity. The waiting areas were full but not crowded, with the efficient scheduling system Sarah had implemented, ensuring minimal waiting times. Children played in specially designed areas while waiting for appointments, their laughter mixing with the general buzz of conversation. "Mr. Blackwood," called Mrs. Harrison, who had become the center's unofficial historian. "Come see what the youth group has accomplished." He followed her to a new exhibition space where teenagers were setting up displays about the center's first 9 months. Professional-looking infographics showed the number of patients served, programs implemented, and lives impacted. But more touching were the personal stories, photographs and testimonials from community members whose lives had been changed. "We're tracking everything," explained one of the young volunteers proudly. Dr. Thomas says data tells important stories. Indeed, the stories were remarkable. Early intervention programs had caught several serious conditions in children. The elderly had found new purpose in the intergenerational activities. Local unemployment had decreased thanks to the center's training programs. Sarah appeared at his side, now wearing the official center uniform they had designed together. "Morning clinic's done," she said, matching his contemplative mood. "Remember when we worried if anyone would come?" Now they had the opposite challenge, managing the growing demand while maintaining the personal touch that made the center special. They had already started discussions about how to expand their services without losing their community focus. "Thomas asked me to join his meeting with Michael next week," Sarah said quietly. "They've been talking more regularly. Michael's been consulting on some of our outreach programs." Marcus nodded, noting the calm in his sister's voice when she spoke of her former husband. Time and success had healed many old wounds, though some scars would always remain. "Dad," James called again, "the Minister of Health is on the line. They want to discuss rolling out our model nationally." As Marcus headed to take the call, he passed the sensory room where Thomas was working with a young patient. Through the glass, he could see his nephew's gentle interaction with the child, so different from the corporate dealings that had once defined the Blackwood name. The cafe was busy as usual, serving not just coffee, but also as a training ground for local youth interested in hospitality. Marcus grabbed a cup, prepared by a beaming young barista, who proudly told him she'd just been accepted to university, the first in her family to go. In his small office, now decorated with community artwork and family photos, Marcus took the minister's call. As he explained their approach, he found himself using words that would have seemed foreign to him 2 years ago. Words like community engagement, social impact, and sustainable care. After the call, he sat for a moment, looking at a particular photo on his desk. It showed the whole family at the center's 6-month celebration. Sarah in her uniform, Thomas in his doctor's coat, James with his ever-present tablet, and even Michael in the background, tentatively present but trying. Mrs. Harrison had insisted on being in the picture too, declaring herself the family's adopted grandmother. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. It was one of the center's success stories, a former addict who had found purpose working in their maintenance team. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Blackwood, but the primary school kids are here for their health education session. They've been asking for you." Marcus smiled. These sessions had become one of his favorite parts of the week. Who would have thought that a hardened businessman would find joy in teaching children about nutrition and exercise? As he walked to the education room, he passed the wall of photographs documenting the center's journey. The before and after shots were striking, not just of the building but of the people. Faces that had once looked worn with worry now showed hope and purpose. The children's excited chatter grew louder as he approached the room. 9 months ago, he would have felt out of place in such a setting. Now, it felt like exactly where he belonged. Life had a funny way of leading you where you needed to be, even if the path there included wrong turns on rainy nights. Sarah caught his eye as he passed the nursing station, giving him a knowing smile. They had both found their way home, though home had turned out to be something very different from what either of them had imagined. 1 year to the day after that fateful rainy encounter, the Blackwood family gathered in the center's main hall for a special celebration. The space had been transformed for the evening, with soft lighting and tables arranged for an intimate dinner. But this wasn't just any anniversary celebration, it was the graduation ceremony for their first class of community health trainees. 20 local residents, ranging from teenagers to retirees, sat proudly in their ceremonial gowns. They had completed various training programs, from healthcare administration to nursing assistance to community outreach, all designed to ensure the center would continue to be staffed by people who understood the community's needs. Thomas stood at the podium, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "When we opened this center, we had a vision of healthcare that went beyond traditional medicine. We dreamed of creating a place where healing meant more than just treating illness. It meant building connections, fostering understanding, and empowering people to care for themselves and each other." Sarah, sitting between Marcus and James, wiped away a tear as her son continued. "Looking at our first graduating class, I see that dream becoming reality. Each of you brings something unique to our center, something that no amount of traditional medical training could provide. You bring the heart of our community. The graduates included Mrs. Harrison's granddaughter, now trained in elderly care coordination. There was the former addict who had become a peer support specialist, a young mother who had trained in pediatric nursing assistance while her own child received care at the center. James took the stage next, his natural enthusiasm tempered by genuine emotion. You're not just graduating with certificates tonight. You're becoming part of a new approach to community healthcare. Already we have inquiries from across the country and beyond about our training program. You are pioneers showing what's possible when we invest in people as well as facilities. As Marcus watched the ceremony unfold, he felt a gentle touch on his arm. Sarah had slipped him a note, written on the same type of napkin where she had scribbled her phone number that rainy night a year ago. Opening it, he read, "Look what we built from a wrong turn." The graduates came forward one by one to receive their certificates. Each had a story, a journey that had led them to this moment. Marcus and Sarah had insisted on knowing all their stories, understanding that every personal connection strengthened the center's foundation in the community. Michael, who had become a regular volunteer at the center, sat quietly at the back of the hall. He caught Thomas's eye as the ceremony continued, and father and son shared a small nod. Some relationships couldn't be fully restored, but they could be reimagined, rebuilt into something new and meaningful. After the formal ceremony, as people mingled over refreshments prepared by the cafe's training program, Marcus found himself back in the garden. The autumn air held that same crispness as the night he had found Sarah walking along the road. The solar lights twinkled among the plants, and the sound of happy conversation drifted out from the hall. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Sarah joined him, followed by James and Thomas. "Just thinking about circles," Marcus replied. "How sometimes you have to travel far away from something to find your way back to it." "Speaking of circles," James said, pulling out his tablet with a grin, "wait until you see the plans for the second center. The mayor of Manchester called today. Already thinking about expansion?" Sarah laughed. "We've only just graduated our first class." "Actually," Thomas interjected, "I've been talking with some colleagues in Edinburgh about adapting our model there. The NHS is very interested in our results." Marcus looked at his family, his sister who had never lost her commitment to serving others, his son who had shown him a different way of doing business, his nephew who had turned personal pain into a mission to heal others. They had all changed over the past year, grown in ways none of them had expected. Mrs. Harrison joined them in the garden, carrying a plate of her signature scones. "Room for one more?" "Always," Sarah said warmly, making space on the bench. As they shared the scones and talked about the future, Marcus realized that their story hadn't really ended. It had simply evolved. The center would continue to grow and change, just as they had. New challenges would arise. New opportunities would present themselves, and their family would face them together. The sound of laughter drifted from the hall where the graduates were celebrating with their families. Tomorrow, many of them would start their new roles at the center, beginning their own circles of healing and hope. The garden's herbs released their fragrance into the night air, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. "To wrong turns," Marcus said softly, raising his cup of tea. "To finding our way home," Sarah completed. In the gentle autumn evening, surrounded by family and the fruits of their shared vision, they all understood that sometimes the best endings weren't endings at all, but new beginnings in disguise.